How would you feel if you were confronted by the Almighty God? The answer next on the Prophetic Connection. This place, the Mount of Olives, very near. Fulfilling the prophecy, waiting for the day when the Messiah will come. As we have already seen, there are numerous instances in the Bible when heaven connected with earth, even times when the Almighty God came down. In the last episode, we saw that Jacob dreamed a dream, and he saw a ladder reaching up to heaven, to the very gate of heaven, angels ascending and descending, and God standing at the top of the ladder. In this fourth episode, we're going to examine a man who had an encounter with God on the top of a holy mountain. And that story is found in Exodus in chapter 19 and beginning in verse 1. In the 3rd month after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on the same day they came to the wilderness of Sinai, for they had departed from Rephidim, had come to the wilderness of Sinai, and camped in the wilderness. So Israel camped there before the mountain. This is the holy mountain. And Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel." That encounter and what God said to Moses is the subject of this episode.
According to the Bible, Moses was an exceptional leader among men. In fact, God chose Moses to lead the people of Israel out of bondage and slavery in Egypt to freedom in the Promised Land. But who was Moses? And why did God choose him for such an incredible assignment?
Moses was another chosen vessel of God. When you look at his life, it all seemed accidental to Moses. I mean, here he's a Hebrew child that's raised as an Egyptian prince, and then he becomes a fugitive and a criminal and a Midianite shepherd, and then he becomes his liberator and lawgiver. His life is continually being reinvented. But we learn that it was God's chosen plan for him. He's uniquely called and chosen to be the liberator of Israel. He's the only one who can go back and confront Pharaoh. He's empowered by God with signs and wonders to part the Red Sea, to bring the plagues on Egypt, and to bring the children of Israel to freedom. Then he becomes the lawgiver and the leader. He's a chosen vessel, and God wanted a man specifically with his background, with his gifting for that particular purpose and time.
We know from the Bible that God came down and met Moses face to face on a mountain. But where was this holy mountain?
When the children of Israel come out of Egypt at the Passover, they cross through the Red Sea, there's a fairly good timeline that the Bible gives us about where they stopped and where they rested and where God gave his instructions and things like that. I've come to understand that when we talk about the mountain of the Lord, the mountain where God met Moses, to give him the law, to speak to him face to face, and all of the stories that we understand, that there was one particular mountain amongst a mountain chain. And so you're going to find in the Bible different references to the location based on what it is that the author is describing. Is he describing the country that it was in? Is the author describing the mountain chain that was the meeting place? Or is the author describing the actual mountain peak within that chain, within that country that God was meeting Moses? So for me, it's a little bit more of a broad brush stroke. It's a place where God met with Moses in the sight of the people. I do think it was outside the land of Israel. It appears they had not made it yet. That doesn't come later until Joshua 1. So it's somewhere between, I think we can say confidently, between the exit from the Red Sea in Egypt and before Joshua crosses the River Jordan with the people of Israel. But it's in that family of mountain chains of Horeb and Mount Sinai, something along those lines.
Can the location of this holy mountain be more precisely pinpointed according to Jewish thought and tradition?
The honest answer from the Jewish perspective is we don't know exactly where it is. It's deliberately kept vague, probably out of a desire not to turn it into some sort of site that would become a site of pilgrimage and even a site of idolatry. The holy mountain, by the way, where the Jewish people get the Torah and the revelation takes place where the Ten Commandments is actually moved, not the physically moved, but the site of the Holy Mountain today for the Jewish people is Jerusalem. It's the Temple Mount underneath the Gold Dome. And the difference between the two places is God's residency, or the connection that takes place at Mount Sinai, is temporary. In Jerusalem, we say it is permanent. We say that God's presence always rests there with or without a Jewish state or Jews being in Israel or a temple being located on the top of that Mount Moriah in the center of the old city of today. But you can go to the Sinai today. Generally speaking, most opinions hold. There's not a lot of rabbinic discussion on the location of Mount Sinai. If God didn't choose to mark the spot, the rabbis don't spend too much time throughout history worrying about where it is. It's more the events that took place there than the physical location. There's a place in the Sinai today, St. Catherine's, but it's not based on Jewish tradition. There's an opinion that it's in Saudi Arabia. I just saw a little documentary on that there's a different mountain, a different route. There's much debate on this, the route of the Exodus, the crossing, the splitting of the sea, the location of Mount Sinai. Simply put, in Jewish perspective, it really isn't important, the actual physical location. It's much more important what happened there. What happened there is the most important event really in Jewish history.
The question then becomes, what really happened on the Holy Mountain? And why is this encounter between God and Moses so important where Jewish history is concerned?
According to the Bible, God gave Moses his laws and wrote them on the tablets of stone with the finger of God. God spoke prophetically to him, gave him the laws, and the laws define how God manages and runs his kingdom. He's a lawful God. There's order in his kingdom. The laws protect the individual and the family, protect property. They guarantee freedom for the people of Israel, for the servants of Israel, for the stranger that comes across the border. I mean, these are good laws, and we understand from watching modern history that any nation that has chosen to live by the rule of law really prospers. There's something about good law at the foundation of society that guarantees freedom and brings prosperity.
If Moses really did encounter God on the Holy Mountain, where he received not only the Ten Commandments, but also moral and ethical codes established by God for Israel, then it is clear that Israel is no ordinary nation, but is rather a nation called to reflect God's righteous standards before all nations on earth. Don't go away. After this short break, Dr. John Tweedy returns with his teaching.
I'm standing on the north shore of the Dead Sea, and to my right, the mountains of Moab, which today are in the kingdom of Jordan. And on the top of one of those mountains is referred to as Pisgah or Nebo. And perhaps Nebo was the summit of Pisgah. That's mentioned in Deuteronomy 34, and it's actually the mountain on which Moses was allowed to see the promised land where I'm standing, but was not allowed to enter it. And according to Deuteronomy 34, Moses died on that mountain, and God buried his body in a valley over there in what today is the kingdom of Jordan. But mountains loom large throughout Moses' life and ministry. And the focus of this particular episode is the holy mountain where God came down and talked with Moses, but more than that, gave him the law. So we found the account in Exodus 19, and Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice, and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine." So here God refers to his sovereignty over all things, as the creator of all things, but also that Israel is to be a special treasure above all nations, but for a purpose. And they would pay the price for being special. But their purpose was to reflect heaven's light in the world and keep the covenants of God and the laws of God so that man could live by God's standards. And here's how special they were to be in verse 6. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. Now, remember, God is speaking, and this is a holy mountain. And when God comes down, then the holy presence is on that mountain. And so we read these words. So Moses came and called for the elders of the people and laid before them all these words which the Lord commanded him. Then all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. So Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. And then in verse 9, and the Lord said to Moses, and this is a warning to the people, behold, I come to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you and believe you forever. So Moses told the words of the people to the Lord. But then comes the consecration of the people that must take place first, or God will have no communication with Israel. Then the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes, and let them be ready for the third day. For on the third day the Lord will come down upon Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Now I have been to the Sinai Peninsula, and I've climbed the traditional site of the Holy Mountain. And I led a small group. I had a tour, and we were in Egypt, and 10 out of some 40 people decided to go with me up the Holy Mountain. We left at midnight to walk. And I remember that it took us 5 hours to reach the summit, and we were trying to be there for the sunrise over the Holy Mountain. And in fact, a couple of the men, they were elderly, they had to get camels and ride up on the camels because they just were virtually exhausted. And we're climbing up in the darkness, and camels are going by. And as we were climbing, I could see the lights high above winding up toward the summit of the mountain. And we were led by a young Bedouin boy, a teenager, who made that climb, he told me, 4 times in each week. But what a glorious view we had from the top of that holy mountain. And so God tells Moses to tell the people to consecrate themselves, but then he says, and here's the warning, verse 12, you shall set bounds for the people all around, saying, take heed to yourselves that you do not go up to the mountain or touch its base. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. Not a hand shall touch him, but he shall surely be stoned or shot with an arrow, whether man or beast, he shall not live. When the trumpets sound long, they shall come near the mountain. So Moses went down from the mountain to the people and sanctified the people, and they washed their clothes. And he said to the people, be ready the third day, do not come near your wives. So there's a total consecration of Israel taking place. The men and women were not to be engaged in sexual things, because God has them separated for a time that they may be consecrated. And in fact, the warning is also for the priests. In verse 21, and the Lord said to Moses, go down and warn the people, lest they break through to gaze at the Lord, and many of them perish. Also let the priests who come near the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them. And then this in verse 23, but Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, set bounds around the mountain and consecrate it. Then the Lord said to him, away, get down, and then come up, you and Aaron with you. But do not let the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them. So Moses went down to the people and spoke to them. What we need to understand about this encounter between God and Moses is this. The Lord God Almighty has come down to earth. He's chosen a particular mountain to meet with Moses. And all around the mountain, the encampment of Israel. And God has set the boundaries. He's given warnings that the people be not even the priests, lest they break through and gaze upon the Almighty God and die on the spot. But now, God is going to give Moses the standards for Israel, the means by which the whole world will know the God of all creation requires this from the nations that he creates and from men and women as individuals. And then God says, recorded in Exodus 20 and verse 1, "And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow to them nor serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me." Consider those words and the compounding effect when one generation refuses to walk with God and commits sins against the standards of God, how that affects the children, the grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren. And when we look at our society today, where most nations have given up on God and where they have thrown out these 10 commandments that I am reading, look at those nations and ask about a correlation between not walking with God and inheriting disaster and social problems that just compound from generation to generation. And I'm going to continue reading these 10 commandments because they've been virtually removed from the public discourse. And we realize that, especially in our Western society, people file lawsuits to get the 10 commandments removed from the entranceways to buildings, libraries, in fact, even schools. So in other words, the society is taking a stand against the Holy One of Israel, the God of Israel. And the sad thing is that in most cases, they don't even realize the consequences of their actions that are reflected in social disaster all over the landscape. And so we continue to read, because the 10 Commandments, if societies could do their best to keep the 10 Commandments and honor God in keeping them, I can tell you that the society would be better, it would be much improved, and instead of going from disaster to disaster, each generation would reap the benefits of the one before because it sowed good seeds into God's fields. Verse 6, "But showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of your Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy." And what have we done with that? 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. In other words, if we keep the Sabbath day, we get a blessing on the Sabbath day. And you know what? We weren't designed to work 24/7. And that one day of rest in the week, to spend time with our families, to rejuvenate ourselves, to reflect upon God's call upon our lives. So when we don't keep the seventh day, then we miss out on the blessing that God has put upon the seventh day. Then verse 12, "Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land, which the Lord your God is giving you." Respect for the elderly. "You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, or his donkey, nor anything else that is your neighbor's." 10 basic rules, standards, but not to limit life where we're concerned, but to enhance it for our benefit, For each time we violate one of God's commandments, we pay the price. And if we look around today, broken families, distraught mothers, single mothers not knowing how they're going to take care of their children, the abuse of children, we've abandoned God. And so God abandons us. And in fact, having given Israel these 10 commandments, Moses will reiterate them and repeat them in Deuteronomy, which is really the book of second law. And there he will list the blessings for being obedient to the commandments of God, but the curses for being disobedient. And those are directed at Israel. But we can be sure by interpretation that every one of the blessings we can experience, and every one of the curses we can experience. So let's ask ourselves, is our world better off by abandoning God and His commandments? Or is it much worse off for having given up on the God of all creation?
Don't go away. There's more from Dr. John Tweedy after this short break.
When we ask the question, why did God choose Israel above all other nations on the earth? In fact, the truth is God raised up Israel, and it's the only nation on earth that can claim that. All other nations have evolved through wars, treaties after wars, but Israel was uniquely called of God to become a nation through Jacob and his 12 sons. But when we ask the question, why is Israel special? God answers that question for us in Deuteronomy in chapter 7, in verse 7. Hear the words of God. This is part of the law that God gave Moses, but here it is. The Lord did not set His love on you, nor choose you, because you were more in number than any other people, for you were the least of all peoples. But because the Lord loves you, and because He would keep the oath which He swore to your fathers, the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand, and redeemed you from the house of bondage, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Now concerning the land, God says in Deuteronomy 11, verse 8, and this is a warning as well as a promise. Therefore you shall keep every commandment which I command you this day, that you may be strong and go in and possess the land which you cross over to possess. Verse 9, and that you may prolong your days in the land which the Lord swore to give to your fathers, to them and to their descendants, a land flowing with milk and honey. You know, Israel's fortunes have risen and fallen according to how they kept the commandments of God. There were good times and bad times. Sometimes they were walking under the blessings that God promised through Moses. Other times they found themselves on the other side of the equation under the curse when they failed to follow God's commands. Now I'm standing on a busy street corner intersection. Behind me, the building you can see is the Knesset. Knesset in Hebrew means meeting place. And here the modern Parliament of Israel assembles to lead this nation. And Israel was reestablished in 1948 after 1,878 years of exile among the Gentile nations. It's a curious thing about Israel, she has prospered in spite of everything and all the wars that have been fought and the enemies that have risen up against her throughout history, and probably never more so than today in the 21st century. But Israel has a secret. She's far from perfect, but she tries to keep the commandments of God. 3,800 years after Israel was established, in a sense, God is still blessing Israel. Now, we have just passed through Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And I can tell you that most Israeli vehicles were parked. There was no public transportation. Here is a modern nation in the 21st century still honoring the commandments of God all these years later, specifically the Ten Commandments to honor God and to keep the Sabbath. When Western nations and European nations have almost given up and forgotten all about the Ten Commandments and in fact have stopped worshiping God altogether. Is there a correlation? I believe there is. The troubles that the Western nations are dealing with today, I believe, in part, are due to the fact they no longer walk with God. Israel is not perfect, but she still tries to obey God and keep His commandments, and that's the secret of her endurance and her success. In the next episode, we're going to examine Joshua's encounter with the mysterious commander of the Lord's army.
Thanks for watching The Prophetic Connection, and join us next week for the commander of the Lord's army.